Okay, we're going to get started. I'm Sonia Michelle. I'm Director of United States Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to this meeting of the Washington History Seminar, which is a joint project of the National History Center, of two programs here at the Wilson Center, the History and Public Policy Program and my own program, United States Studies. And it's also co-sponsored by Schaefer, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and we're very appreciative of their support. The mission of the Wilson Center, as many of you know, is to create a bridge between the world of scholarship and the world of public policy. And this seminar series, which bears the rubric Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs, does that very well. And the work of today's speaker, Klaus Lauritz, fits very well into this paradigm, as you'll soon hear. He's going to be discussing Churchill and the Cold War. Klaus Lauritz is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of Ulster. He's currently a visiting professor at Yale University and a senior research fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And unfortunately, we don't have a high-speed rail system set up yet between New Haven and Washington, which means that his commute is probably somewhat longer than it would be in any civilized country, like parts of Europe. Larry's has been selected as a fellow of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, the UK's Royal Historical Society, the American Academy of Political Science, and the Ideas Center for International Affairs, Diplomacy and Strategy at the London School of Economics. Previously, Lauritz was a professor in international relations at the University of London, the Jean Monnet Professor at Queen's University Belfast, and he's also held the Henry Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress. Lauritz is an expert on transatlantic relations and on American, German, and British foreign policies in comparative perspective. His work focuses on the repercussion of U.S.-driven globalization on the political, economic, and cultural transformation processes in Europe and elsewhere, and on the political geostrategic developments in the post-Cold World War, and also on the history, politics, and economics of European integration. Among his numerous publications are Churchill's Cold War, The Politics of Personal Diplomacy, Blackwell's Companion to Europe Since 1945, and the U.S. Secretaries of State and Transatlantic Relations. His latest book project is entitled Enlightened Self-Interest, the United States and the Unity of Europe from Truman to Obama. Before turning the microphone over to Professor Lauritz, our co-organizer, Roger Lewis from the National Historical Center, History Center has something to say.
I'd just like to welcome everyone on behalf of the National History Center as well as the Woodrow Wilson Center. I've known Klaus among other ways when he held the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, which is a rather daunting title to hold. I once knew someone who held the chair at Princeton as the John Foster Dulles professor. I'm not sure which you would actually prefer if you were making the choice, Klaus. I have noticed from Klaus's other lectures that I've attended that on some occasions he seems to have acquired some Churchillian characteristics, the Churchillian cadence in the method of delivery, and it will be a matter of interest to see whether you are able to sustain this, Klaus. And I have noticed among the audience, those who have turned up today, some have come because of Klaus, but others have come because of Churchill himself. Before we begin the lecture, could we just go around the room and ask people to identify themselves? We need a, here we go with a microphone.
Should they say whether they came because of Klaus or because of Churchill?
Gavin Wright from Stanford, and I'm a fellow here at the center this year.
Bill Burr at the National Security Archive at GW.
David Nichols, Historian's Office at the Department of State.
Irene Sanchez, I'm here as a visiting researcher at Georgetown.
Francisco Rodriguez, postdoctoral Fulbright in George Washington University.
Steve Lipson, grad student at Catholic University of America.
Isaac Sprick, intern at the American Historical Association.
Robert Townsend, Assistant Director at the American Historical Association. Miriam House, Cunningham, the National History Center.
Pilaricity Sudhir, also the American Historical Association.
Chris Barrett, I'm Australian scholar here at the centre.
Tony Cully-Foster, Professor at Communications at the University of Ulster and Chairman of the Global Communications Committee at the World Affairs Council.
Ted Kiefer, an historian at the OSD History Office.
Arnita Johns, historian.
Brent Cantley, no affiliation. I'm here because of Klaus.
Aaron Mahan, the Historical Office, Department of Defense.
Stanley Falk, historian.
Patrick Flanagan, student at SAIS.
Carol Sang, retired historian.
Mel Leffler, University of Virginia and public policy scholar at the Wilson Center.
大家好，我 East China Normal University. I'm fellow of public policy scholar here now.
Ronald Steele, University of Southern California and Wilson scholar.
Susan Carruthers, I'm a history professor at Rutgers in Newark and a fellow here this year.
Оксана Likarenko, Kennan Institute scholar.
Tim McDonald, I work here at the center.
Yvonne Deans, consultant with the World Bank.
Elizabeth Monarch, the Voice of America.
Curtis Anderson, student at SAIS.
Margaret Yeo, intern at the Wilson Center.
Alice Pinot, intern.
If I had had my wits about me, I would have asked people to declare themselves for or against Churchill. In American audiences, it's always almost unanimously in favor, but in other parts of the world, India, for example, it would be almost the reverse. Klaus Laurie on Churchill's Cold War Revisited.
Thank you very much. I hope that applause isn't premature. I'll try not to disappoint you about either myself or about Churchill. And thank you very much for these very nice introductions. I couldn't resist today to make a little PowerPoint presentation because, as you know, Churchill has was the motive of very many interesting pictures. So I haven't resisted. I hope the technology will work. I've actually written 2 books on Churchill, Churchill's Cold War, and one in German, Politics of Illusions. Of course, both of these books are great read and highly recommended. As you know, it's Valentine's Day today, and usually it always is easy to find a Churchill quote on almost anything under the sun, but I failed to find a quote on Churchill and Valentine's Day. So he never seems to have said anything about it, so I thought I'd just make up a Valentine's slide anyway, just for your amusement. However, what I did find was that at the moment, a set of gold-plated dentures worn by Churchill are currently on sale. Actually, the upper dentures were deliberately designed to be loose-fitting so that Churchill could keep the lisp that people were accustomed to hearing during his wartime radio broadcasts. What all this shows, of course, is that Churchill very much has become a historical figure, frequently used for anecdotes and simple entertainment. And also that Churchill is still largely remembered only as Britain's leader of the Second World War. And here we have him in 1945. Churchill's post-1945 career, his Cold War years, so to speak, are hardly remembered. And these years were not insignificant either. In fact, I believe they were quite important. Churchill himself realized in the years after 1945 that he would go down in history as a wartime premier and a war leader rather than also as a peacemaker. The longer he lived, the more depressed he became about that. His ambition for the post-1945 years was threefold, I believe. Let me say something about each of these points. First, he wanted to be re-elected as Prime Minister by the British people. As you know, he never was elected as wartime leader. On 10th May 1940, he became Prime Minister when he succeeded Chamberlain, without, however, the British people having voted him into office. However, the British people did kick him out of office. In August 1945, he and the Conservative Party lost the general election, and Churchill became the leader of His Majesty's opposition. In fact, however,
Anthony Eden and Reb Butler led the opposition, while Churchill dealt with a severe bout of depression in the aftermath of the election defeat. He soon went to the south of France to enjoy the sun, the wine, and focus on his painting. He was not particularly interested in dealing with the day-to-day political work in the House of Commons, and who can blame him? But he actually used his time to work on his war memoirs. However, it has to be said that Churchill had a number of very good assistants who did the research and also an awful lot of the writing. On one occasion, one of his assistants, David Kelly, sent a rewrite of Volume 1 to him with the comment, "And I'm sure you will enjoy reading what I feel is one of the best books you have yet written." Why did Churchill and the Tories lose the election? Churchill was personally still highly popular, but he was seen as a war leader. He was not seen as someone who had creative and forward-looking constructive ideas for Britain in the post-1945 world. This above all applied to the domestic side of things. The British people, including the soldiers in the field, did not think he was to entrust with the building of a welfare state and the creation of a more democratic and egalitarian Britain. In particular, the Conservative Party and Churchill personally lost the young generation. And his election defeat bothered him deeply. When the new Prime Minister, Labour leader Clement Attlee, offered him the very distinguished Order of the Garter for his wartime service, Churchill responded by saying, "Why should I accept the Order of the Garter when I've already been given the Order of the Boot by the British people?" And he did accept the Garter, but when he resigned in 1955. And this looks how one looks a little bit ridiculously when one has to dress up like that. Although the somewhat small and withdrawn Clement Attlee had been his deputy during the war years, Churchill did not think much of him. For example, in Parliament, he once said about the new Prime Minister, "Attlee is a modest man, and he has a lot to be modest about." Or, he also said, "An empty taxi arrived at 10 Downing Street, and the door opened, and Attlee got out." Second, when Churchill was leader of the opposition between 1945 and 1951, he wanted to establish himself as a statesman who still counted, despite being out of power. He thought he could best do this by developing a vision for the post-Cold War world. And his speeches in Zurich and The Hague, where he called for the creation of a united and integrated Europe, were the attempts to create such a vision. And indeed, the peoples of Europe were very inspired by Churchill's pro-European rhetoric. In Zurich, on the 19th of September 1946, Churchill declared dramatically, "We must build a kind of United States of Europe. If Europe is to be saved from infinite misery and indeed from final doom," he pronounced, "there must be an act of faith in the European family. And the first step for this must be a partnership between France and Germany. In any case," he said, "under the umbrella of the United Nations, we must recreate the European family in a regional structure called the United States of Europe." 2 years later, when he spoke at the first European Congress in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in early May 1948, he once again declared that the movement for European unity must be a positive force, deriving its strength from our sense of common spiritual values. We must rebuild Europe from its ruins and make its light shine forth again upon the world. He was much relieved, he said, that the United States was not hostile to the idea of a United States of Europe, but actually the United States welcomed it and ardently desired it, he said. He now called for the establishment of a united European army. Let me see whether I can do that here. That was the Congress of The Hague, and just a few seconds from Churchill's performance.
This is not a movement of parties, but a movement of people. It must be all for all. Europe can only be united by the heartfelt wish and vehement expression of the great majority of all the peoples, in all the parties, in all the freedom-loving countries, no matter where they dwell or how they vote. It is indeed fitting, ladies and gentlemen, that this first Congress of Europe should meet in Holland, which with her neighbors of the Benelux group is already leading the way by our example, and for whose hospitality and countenance we express our gratitude. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, Benelux, that happy novel term, is at once a model and a pioneer for our immediate advance, for the immediate forward step of many other countries. We cannot aim at anything less than the union of Europe as a whole, and we look forward with confidence to the day when that union will be achieved.
Oop, that was not the idea. Well, all this rhetoric certainly gave new hope and a vision for the future of the Western world. However, there was a much overlooked problem at the time, and particularly with Churchill and his inspirational speeches. Churchill did not really mean what he said. In Churchill's mind, Britain was not supposed to be part of this united Europe. Britain, just like the United States and the Soviet Union, he said, must be the friends and sponsors of the new united Europe, no more, no less. Britain would actually not be part of such a united Europe. Yet these sentences were much overlooked at the time. And indeed, when Churchill came back as Prime Minister in October 1951, he did not pursue his European unity theme. In fact, he couldn't care less, and Britain did not join the Schuman Plan of 1950-51, which the Labour government had refused to sign up to. The new Churchill government did not even discuss the matter whether or not to join. It never was an issue of debate. Churchill had only used the European unity theme to have a theme, to raise his popular profile, to present a vision for the post-war world. But once he had actually obtained power, he totally lost interest. And Churchill's pro-European statements can have much to do with the influence of Duncan Sandys, one of his son-in-laws, who was highly pro-European, was a conservative MP, and he pushed Churchill into that direction. And he wrote many of these speeches. In addition to the European theme, during his opposition years, Churchill once again wished to go down in history as a prophet. As he had warned of the dangers of the Nazis and Hitler in the 1930s, he now claimed to have foreseen the Soviet threat. This was kind of more difficult, as after all he had collaborated with Stalin during World War II, and some of his utterances in admiration of Uncle Joe were well known. And frankly, despite the Katyn massacre, the enforced inaction of the Red Army during the Warsaw Uprising, and all the many other atrocities ordered by Stalin, of which Churchill and Roosevelt were well aware, both leaders competed for Stalin's attention. They were clearly fascinated by his bizarre personality and occasional personal charm. While Churchill swayed to and fro, he did not foresee the post-war Soviet danger as clearly as he had seen the danger emanating from Hitler. His Iron Curtain speech in early 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, was meant to rectify this in the global public imagination. And we can read in Khrushchev's memoirs that the Soviet leadership, from Stalin downwards, was appalled by his speech. For the Kremlin, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was a decisive opening shot in the Cold War. Churchill's greatest ambition, however, during both his time in opposition and when he became Prime Minister again in October 1951, his greatest ambition was to go down in history as a peacemaker. Already in his Iron Curtain speech, officially called The Sinews of Peace, he did not only talk about the necessity of firmness in the face of Soviet aggression. He said, for example, that he did not think that a new war is inevitable or imminent. What is needed, he said, was a settlement with the Soviet Union, and the longer this was delayed, the more difficult it would be. He preached for good understanding on all points with Russia. And these were not the words of a cold warrior, as Churchill has usually been portrayed in the literature. This was a man who was already concerned about the developing Cold War, who thus wanted to achieve a deal with Stalin before things got out of hand. He took this theme, ending the Cold War, much more seriously than the European unity theme. With regard to ending the Cold War, with overcoming the East-West conflict, he actually meant what he said. During the Cold War, Churchill clearly saw himself as a peacemaker who rightly deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. In the spring of 1953, an assistant stormed into Churchill's office in 10 Downing Street and shouted full of excitement, "Prime Minister, I just heard from Stockholm that you have been awarded the Nobel Prize." And Churchill got all excited himself and was clearly very pleased. But then the assistant told him it was a Nobel Prize for Literature rather than the Nobel Peace Prize. Churchill was utterly devastated. He didn't think the Nobel Literature Prize was all that important. What he had wanted was a Nobel Peace Prize for trying to overcome the Cold War and end the East-West conflict. He therefore didn't even bother to go to Stockholm himself to collect the prize. He sent his wife. As he was too busy, he said, but he still wanted to collect the prize money. And here we have the Queen of Sweden and his lovely wife. For the remainder of my talk, I would like to focus on Churchill's attempts to realize his dream of becoming a peacemaker by bringing the Cold War to an early end. Churchill was strongly convinced that the Cold War needed to be relaxed, otherwise the world would find itself embroiled in an apocalyptic nuclear confrontation between East and West. He believed deeply that the prevention of such a dreadful scenario required a less conflict-ridden and more constructive relationship with the Soviet Union. The death of Joseph Stalin on the 5th of March 1953, and more importantly the ensuing peace offensive of his successors, led the Prime Minister to embark on a sustained campaign to stabilize East-West relations through summit diplomacy. He thought that entering into negotiations with Stalin's successors was necessary to maintain a peaceful world safely divided into spheres of influence. As you know, Stalin, who we see in the top two pictures, was succeeded by a collective three-person leadership team. They were all honorable and distinguished men, of course. The team of rivals consisted of the lovely torturer Beria, the slimy and somewhat dim Malenkov, and the stubborn Mr. Niet Molotov, with the robust Nikita Khrushchev hovering in the background. And from 1953 to 1955, Churchill worked tirelessly to promote a high-level dialogue between the Cold War camps that ultimately culminated in the 1955 Geneva summit meeting, the first since the Potsdam Conference. And what really bothered Churchill, and the more time went by, that was the danger of the nuclear bomb. And he increasingly became concerned about what the United States, who he didn't entirely trust, what the United States might do in case of an emergency, of a rising confrontation with the Soviet Union. He welcomed Eisenhower's inauguration as U.S. President in January 1953, as Churchill believed that Eisenhower was more flexible than Truman. Incidentally, he had already tried with Truman between 51 and 53 to convince Truman that it might be sensible to enter into negotiations with Stalin at that time, but Truman did not want to hear of it, and Churchill had a rather, let's say, tense relationship with Truman. So he was quite relieved when Eisenhower, his old comrade in arms from the Second World War, got elected president, and he clearly hoped that he could push Eisenhower about, and he soon noticed that that was not the case at all. Then, as I said, on the 5th of March 1953, Stalin's sudden death was announced. And as early as the 28th of March 1953, Churchill told Foreign Secretary Eden that he would like to meet the new leaders in Moscow. As a first step, Churchill thought it worth Eden's while to go to the Soviet capital for an informal discussion with Molotov, the new foreign minister. After some initial enthusiasm, Eden, however, was persuaded to oppose the venture by his Foreign Office advisers, who, like their counterparts in Washington, were almost unanimously opposed to Churchill's ideas, which they regarded as dangerous, highly naive, and potentially destabilizing for the Western policy of how to conduct the Cold War. Churchill became increasingly dissatisfied with the general opposition to his plans for negotiations with Moscow. He decided to take the initiative himself. And during 1953-54, he embarked on two major attempts to convince his fellow statesmen in the West to overcome the Cold War by embarking on high-level negotiations with Moscow. His first attempt commenced in May 1953. And I would like to say something about each of these attempts, with the first being the major attempt, I believe. In a speech in the House of Commons on the 11th of May 1953, Churchill made his envisaged political course clear. He called for a summit conference with the Soviet Union à la Potsdam. The real importance of his speech, however, did not consist only in his call for a summit conference. The importance of the speech can be found in the passage in which he emphasized the interconnection between German reunification, European security, and the end of the Cold War. Churchill also explained that along the lines of the massive thought of the Treaty of Locarno of 1925, the West, meaning Britain, had to offer a security guarantee to the Soviet Union. He believed that what the Locarno Treaty had provided for France should now be provided for the Soviet Union. He explained in his speech, the master thought was based on the simple provision that if Germany attacked France, we should stand with the French, and if France attacked Germany, we should stand with the Germans. Thus Churchill's basic concept consisted of the idea to transfer the security system of 1925 for Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe and make Great Britain the decisive arbiter between Germany and the USSR. While this might have been a reasonable idea in 1925, in 1953 it sounded very much like an outdated proposal from yesteryear. Britain simply did not have the influence, the power, and above all, it didn't have the financial and military means to be able to be the guarantor of peace between the Soviet Union and Germany, or the Soviet Union and any other country for that matter. And Churchill was not motivated solely by high-minded goals of peace and détente. Pragmatic concerns also animated his diplomacy. Underlying Churchill's plan was a clear desire to enhance and maintain Britain's position as a great power by making London responsible for overseeing the future relationship between Moscow and Germany. An end to the Cold War would also enable his country to lessen its military commitments and in the long run catch up economically, perhaps with the United States of America, thus making Britain less dependent on Washington. Not surprisingly, he also hoped to delay his retirement as long as possible by bringing about these East-West negotiations, which would last a considerable period of time, at least a few years. And there was constantly pressure on Churchill to retire. And Eden, his heir apparent and foreign secretary, he really waited in the wings and was hopeful almost any month that Churchill would announce his retirement and he could become prime minister. But Churchill, being Churchill, he couldn't be moved at all. Moreover, and much more important in a way, Churchill wished to solve the German question. In several confidential conversations, Churchill expressed the notion that a reunited and neutral Germany and the sacrifice of the Federal Republic's rearmament and integration with the West might prove a suitable price for an end to the Cold War. The Prime Minister assumed that in view of the fact that Britain would be the guarantor of a security treaty between Germany and the USSR, even Moscow would accept German unification and the division of Europe. And that is what he told a Foreign Office official who then reported it, that he had not closed his mind to the possibility of a unified and neutral Germany. In the West, however, Churchill's ideas were met with the utmost suspicion. The Foreign Office had made sure the Prime Minister's ideas, as set out in Churchill's secret statements, were leaked out and found their way to the Western capitals. Thus, soon the majority of the Prime Minister's own cabinet, including the Foreign Office, as well as the American administration and the West German government, smelled a rat. They were all very much opposed to Churchill's ideas, which they found unrealistic and dangerous. Nevertheless, after May 1953, the West German and American governments accelerated their efforts to draw up plans for the neutralization of Germany, and disengagement plans were looked into it once again, just in case Churchill would succeed with this scheme. And Churchill was under pressure himself. So by late May, he had already weakened his views a little bit. You know, the Foreign Office officials had begun working on him and explaining to him how dangerous it would be if Germany was neutralized and reunited at this stage. So now he was saying, he saw the awful consequences of that policy, but he had still not made up his mind. So the Foreign Office was quite worried, so were the other capitals. In May and June 1953, Churchill managed to talk Eisenhower into coming to a Western Heads of Government conference on Bermuda, where he hoped to convince the president to agree to a three-power summit with Malenkov. Eisenhower, however, had a completely different agenda. Eisenhower had only agreed to the Western Bermuda conference as he wanted to convince Churchill not to seek such a summit. But anyway, that summit was delayed because on the 23rd of June 1953, Churchill suffered a serious stroke. His illness ensured that he was bedridden and out of action for the best part of the next 2 months. And even before his stroke, the uprising in East Germany had happened on the 17th of June 1953. And that uprising, as you know, was put down by great violence by the Soviet Union. Soviet tanks were employed. And that, of course, made Churchill's proposal to negotiate with the Soviet Union at that stage pretty pointless. And even Churchill saw that. And so negotiations with the Soviet Union were not possible. And anyway, Churchill was bedridden for the next 2 months. What the West did was really to now undermine his plans properly. Instead of having that Bermuda meeting, the Western foreign ministers got together at a conference in Washington. And all these foreign ministers, the American, the British, and the French foreign minister basically agreed that there would be no summit, that there would at most be a foreign ministers' conference with the Soviet Union. And the reason why even that foreign ministers' conference was contemplated was only because of public opinion. There were, after Stalin's death, particularly in Germany, public opinion demanded that something happened. And they feared that Adenauer, the West German Chancellor, would lose the next election if they didn't give in to public opinion, at least to some extent, if they simply said, no way, we are not dealing with the Soviet Union at all. So they thought we have to offer public opinion something. So they offered them a foreign ministers' conference, which eventually took place in Berlin in early 1954, but they agreed at that Washington meeting in the summer of 1953 that that conference would fail. And when it did take place in January and February 1954, it clearly failed, and the West maneuvered it in a way that they could actually blame Molotov for having been so intransigent and so stubborn on the German question that he wrecked the conference. In fact, they had already decided 6-7 months beforehand that that conference would definitely fail and that no agreement would be entered into with the Soviet Union. Churchill was convalescing in bed, and he soon recognized what the Western foreign ministers had in mind, but he couldn't do anything as he was much too sick. And above all, he blamed Dulles, the American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, for everything. He didn't really realize that Eisenhower was making American foreign policy and that Dulles was only executing it. He really thought that Eisenhower was the lackey of Dulles. It appeared to him that the president was no more than a puppet in Dulles' hands, he said. Dulles, Churchill said, was a terrible handicap. 10 years ago, I could have dealt with him. Referring to his stroke, he believed that even as it is, I have not been defeated by this bastard. I've been humiliated by my own decay. Famous became his saying, dull, duller, Dulles. And by October 1953, Churchill had sufficiently recovered from his stroke to be back in Downing Street. And almost immediately, he began putting pressure on Eisenhower to have that Bermuda conference after all. And eventually he succeeded, and the conference did take place in December 1953 in Bermuda. It was to be Churchill's last international conference. And the prime ministers, not surprisingly, still hoped to be able to use the meeting to persuade Eisenhower to agree to a Big Three summit conference with Malenkov. Eisenhower, however, still intended to convince Churchill to shelve his summit plans for good. The entire conference was rather chaotic and characterized by personal animosities. Churchill repeatedly clashed with his foreign secretary. Eden wrote to his wife back in England, "I'm hating the whole thing even more than I had expected. The whole thing is a complete circus." 2 days later he wrote, "Here we appear to be living in a nightmare. So far it is chaotic. Please make me retire before I'm 80. Churchill also attempted to ignore the French delegation as much as possible. He even behaved in rather insulting ways, beginning on the very first day when he and French Prime Minister Lanier were awaiting the arrival of Eisenhower at the airport. Rather than engage in polite conversation with the French Prime Minister, Churchill preferred to occupy himself with a goat, the mascot of the Honorary Guard. Already on the plane, he had read a book by C.S. Forester entitled Death to the French. And he conveniently forgot to hide it when he actually met the French delegation. They were impressed. During private discussions in the course of the conference, Churchill reverted to describing the French as bloody frogs. This did not go down well with the French when it was leaked. Moreover, French Foreign Minister Bidot and French Prime Minister Lanier thoroughly disliked each other and hardly talked to each other. On the first day of the conference, the French Prime Minister decided to fall ill. He spent the rest of the conference in bed. Thus, when Eisenhower and Churchill wished to consult him, they had to come to his sickbed. With regard to the Soviet Union, Churchill had to accept the decision taken first at the Washington meeting in July 1953 to invite Moscow to the already doomed Foreign Ministers' Conference in Berlin. He could not prevent that anymore. He was unable to reverse this decision. Indeed, when Churchill made the attempt to persuade President Eisenhower to agree to a real summit conference with Moscow, Eisenhower became increasingly impatient and soon lost his temper. A British diplomat noted in his diary that Eisenhower came down on Churchill like a ton of bricks. Very, very rude, I thought, and vulgar. In the minutes of the meeting, it was reported most soberly that Eisenhower explained that he did not want to approach the problem of negotiating with the Soviets on the basis that there had been any change in the Soviet policy of destroying the capitalist free world by all means, by force, by deceit, or by lies. This was their long-term purpose, he said. There had been no change since Lenin, full stop. Although Churchill was very frustrated by his failure to convince Eisenhower to attend the Big Three summit in Bermuda, he continued to be convinced that it was his responsibility to make the greatest effort to bring about negotiations with Moscow to terminate the Cold War. And that basically was the end of his first attempt. Now, after the Bermuda Conference of 1953, he basically let the matter rest for a few months. But then, in the summer of 1954, he embarked on his second attempt. And that occurred in mid-1954. Anglo-American differences over the war in Indochina gave Churchill another opportunity to travel once again to Washington. Churchill kept bothering Eisenhower about saying, well, I was wondering whether it would be a good idea if I came to Washington. And usually the Americans, including Eisenhower, said, oh, thank you very much. No, we are really busy. Our schedule is full, so they really didn't want to have him over. But suddenly, in the summer of 1954, Eisenhower suddenly agreed. And Churchill was, of course, pleased and thought that Eisenhower had mellowed regarding his summit diplomacy. But that wasn't actually the case at all. While Eisenhower had agreed to Churchill coming over, and he insisted on Foreign Secretary Eden coming as well. Initially, Eden had not wanted to come, but the Americans didn't want to have just Churchill there. They wanted to have the Eden as well, the heir apparent. And the main reason was that Churchill wanted to convince the British to give troops to Indochina. He wanted to help out the French in Dien Bien Phu and in the whole Indochina mess, and he hoped that with British troops being also committed, Congress would actually agree to give its agreement. But because he knew Congress would not agree to just having an American initiative done in Indochina. So basically he asked the British delegation to come over because of Indochina. Churchill, of course, just saw his summit diplomacy. He just wanted to get that summit going. And now he was less interested in the Austrian question. He was less interested in the German question or altering the entire Western setup of how to conduct the Cold War. He talked about the Austrian question. He called about the danger of the nuclear bombs. But he really wanted to have a summit for the sake of having a summit. Since the Bermuda Conference, the rapidly deteriorating Churchill had given up his plans for altering the entire Western Cold War concept. He had resigned himself to the fact that he was unable to change the status quo of a divided Europe. Churchill was increasingly occupied with merely attempting to bring about the mellowing of the international atmosphere, hoping to decrease the probability of the outbreak of war and the destruction of civilization by nuclear conflict. He also wanted to establish his reputation as a politician who had not only succeeded in wartime, but also one who had instigated a process of détente and disarmament. Churchill now also clearly worked for a summit conference in order to postpone his retirement and to make a final dramatic impact on world affairs. And Eisenhower let him and Eden come over. The president, however, was not interested in summit diplomacy at all. The British, however, could not be persuaded to get involved in the Indochina War. Churchill proposed that Eisenhower join him in a Big Three conference with Moscow. When Eisenhower rebuffed the Prime Minister, Churchill announced that he would go to Moscow by himself, on a solitary pilgrimage, as he called it, and explore whether or not the West could do business with Malenkov. Eisenhower was shocked. He had no intention of agreeing to Churchill's proposed initiative. but he found it awfully difficult to converse with Churchill, who was entirely preoccupied with the summit diplomacy. The Prime Minister also had an annoying tendency of switching off his hearing aid, forcing Eisenhower to converse with Churchill in a rather loud way. Still, the President remained polite mostly and respectful to the Prime Minister, who had visibly aged since they had met last. As far as the proposed journey to Moscow was concerned, Eisenhower instructed Dulles to have a word with Churchill to make clear the American opposition to these plans. But Churchill decided to misinterpret the American position, convincing himself that Eisenhower had not really meant what he had said, and that it was only Dulles who was opposed, while Eisenhower was much more flexible. On board the Queen Elizabeth, sailing back from New York back to England, Churchill sent a telegram to Molotov inquiring whether Moscow would accept an invitation to a summit conference. He asked Molotov to invite him to pay a visit to Moscow for an informal visit to talk about a possible Big Three conference. Eden only agreed to the telegram because Churchill had promised to retire immediately after such a visit, and essentially Eden had been talked into it by Churchill, and he again weakly gave in. Eden doesn't make a very good figure in all these affairs, because he always was browbeaten by Churchill and eventually always gave in. And that picture, I think, is quite nice. Churchill talks to the press, and Eden is, obviously bored, yes, and doesn't think much of what his master is saying. The British cabinet had not been consulted, but that is not really correct. Churchill had actually sent a telegram to London, and as you know, in these days there was genuine cabinet government in London, so the Prime Minister could not just embark on a war, for example, as he liked, but he had to consult his cabinet and get his agreement of his cabinet colleagues. There had to be at least a majority decision in favor. So Churchill knew he couldn't just go to Moscow as he pleased, so he had to consult his cabinet colleagues. So he sent a telegram to London, but he sent it on a Sunday. And he knew there would be no one in London to actually read the telegram. And when he didn't have an answer after 2 hours or so, he sent off the telegram to Molotov, as no one obviously had disagreed with him. But when he got back in London, Churchill was confronted with a serious crisis. Most members of his government were strongly opposed to the Prime Minister's initiative, and they dreaded the potentially dire consequences of the ailing Churchill conducting bilateral negotiations with a fit and manipulative man in Moscow and without American participation. Not surprisingly, the American administration was also greatly displeased about Churchill's unexpected initiative. Eisenhower was most annoyed. The crisis almost broke up Churchill's government. Several members, including Churchill himself, talked about tendering their resignations. Most members of Churchill's cabinet believed that Churchill was now quite incapable, mentally as well as physically, of remaining Prime Minister. Churchill said that he didn't give a damn if anyone wished to resign. Harold Macmillan concluded that the Prime Minister thinks about one thing all the time: the Russian visit and his chance of saving the world. Macmillan even talked to Churchill's wife to convince him to retire, but he had no success. Surprisingly enough, the crisis was resolved by a totally unforeseen and for the British cabinet very fortunate Soviet initiative. On the 24th of July 1954, Moscow issued an invitation to a 32-nation conference to draw up a new European security structure. The United States, as a non-European country, had not been invited. In the West, the Kremlin's initiative was regarded as a mere propaganda move and a last-minute attempt to prevent the rearmament and Western integration of the Federal Republic of Germany. In this context, with the West contemplating how to react to this new propaganda move, it seemed impossible for the British Prime Minister to travel to Moscow. Even Churchill agreed with that reasoning. In view of Eden's opposition to his plans and Moscow's initiative, he cynically commented, "Foreign secretaries of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your jobs." He wrote to Molotov that he was unable to visit Moscow at present. The big question is, of course, why did Moscow not accept Churchill's proposal for a solitary pilgrimage to Moscow? After all, the Kremlin was well informed about the controversy and disputes Churchill's idea had caused in the Western world. The Soviets appear to have missed an opportunity to drive a wedge between the United States and Britain. Why were the Soviets so dim, one wonders? I think the answer lies in the fact that the new leaders in the Kremlin did not trust Churchill and his Cold Warrior reputation. After all, Churchill's anti-communist pronouncements and policies went back as far as the Russian Civil War. Stalin had mistrusted the British leader deeply, and the post-1953 Soviet leaders viewed Churchill likewise. They seem to have been convinced that the Prime Minister's summit diplomacy constituted a Western trap. At least a statement by the Soviet diplomat Rodionov supports this interpretation. In a conversation with British diplomat Frank Roberts in mid-August 1954, Rodionov admitted that Moscow had to bear some of the responsibility for the failure of Churchill's summit diplomacy. He told Roberts that the Russian leaders were by no means sure what the Prime Minister really wanted to do at such a meeting, and with their naturally suspicious outlook, they were reluctant to commit themselves to something the outcome of which they could not quite foresee. In the following months, Churchill continued his work for summit conference. However, partly due to the skillful manipulation by his Foreign Office officials, the opportunity did not arise. Moreover, the final refusal of the French Parliament to ratify the EDC Treaty in August 1954 led to a crisis in the Western capitals. An alternative for Germany's rearmament and integration with the West had to be found. This was a long drawn-out process during which Churchill could hardly make yet another effort to travel or to get a conference going and to travel to Moscow. By the time an alternative solution had been found and implemented, West German NATO membership in May 1955, by this time Churchill had already retired on the 5th of April 1955, without having been able to convene a summit conference. After the downfall of Malenkov in Moscow in February 1955, and because of his increasingly failing health, Churchill had given up essentially. And the slide on the left, or the picture on the left, is when the Queen came out of Downing Street after a farewell dinner for Churchill. Churchill had no longer been able to confront the opposition to his plans from Eden, the Foreign Office, Eisenhower and Adenauer, which was still as strong as ever. Still, on occasion, when he thought that his summit diplomacy could still be realized, he threatened to think again about his retirement and to maybe reverse his plans. For example, there were suddenly rumors in April or in March 1955, there was a rumor that Eisenhower, the president, would travel to Europe for the anniversary of D-Day in May 1955. And immediately Churchill thought, well, if Eisenhower comes to Europe, he invites the Soviets as well, and we can have that conference. So he immediately told his Foreign Office official, I may have second thoughts about my retirement. And the Foreign Office got totally upset. They wrote to the American ambassador, said, could you please convince the president not to come to Europe, because that will give us terrible problems. And indeed, Eisenhower didn't come. So Churchill did retire on the 5th of April 1955. However, in July 1955, with Churchill and his dangerous idea safely out of the way, Eisenhower, Eden and French Prime Minister Faure met with the new Soviet leadership team Bulganin and Khrushchev at a top-level conference in Geneva. The meeting, as you know, led to the so-called Spirit of Geneva and a very fleeting and superficial détente. Circumstances did not seem to exist which allowed an end to the Cold War in 1955. When Churchill heard about the Geneva Conference or the preparations for the Geneva Conference, he commented somewhat dryly, because now Eden seemed to have the ambition to be represented at a summit diplomacy himself. Before that, he had always criticized Churchill going to a summit conference. He commented, well, once you get to the top yourself, summit conferences look much more attractive. Still, I believe if it had not been for Churchill's constant pressure to negotiate with the Soviets and convene an international summit meeting of the great powers to overcome the Cold War, the 1955 Geneva Conference, and thus the first thaw in the East-West conflict, might not have occurred. Let me say a few words in conclusion. Churchill's summit diplomacy was a continuation of Churchill's long-standing belief in the value of personal diplomacy at the highest level possible. Yet, in the 1950s, his policy was at least partially based on unrealistic presumptions. Neither Britain nor Churchill himself had the strength at their disposal that would have been needed to see his plans through. After all, they entailed a radical change of the entire Western concept of how to conduct relations with the Soviet Union. The combined opposition of Eisenhower, Adenauer, as well as Eden and his own Foreign Office was understandable, although it was conducted with a great deal of cynicism, both towards Britain's head of government and towards Western public opinion. Moreover, the attempts of the Foreign Office officials to undermine the policy of their own prime minister were rather unconventional, to put it mildly. Yet, Churchill's summit diplomacy also had its very positive and constructive side, I believe. After all, the Geneva Conference of 1955 was convened, thereby breaking the dangerous silence that had characterized East-West relations since the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. And of course, no summit conference had taken place since Potsdam in 1954. The future would see plenty of formal and informal East-West conferences that, despite a number of considerable setbacks, gradually and slowly led to the build-up of a more trusting relationship between the West and the Soviet Union. Without Churchill's endeavors to push for a summit conference, this process might not have started in the early 1950s. Churchill certainly helped create an atmosphere that made war less likely in the years after Stalin's death than at any time since the end of the Second World War. One could even say that by attempting to find a way out of the complex and seemingly irreversible Cold War situation, Churchill showed real courage and vision. He pointed towards a world of interdependence and coexistence. He promoted an awareness of the need of permanent conflict management rather than merely adhering to a black and white views of international affairs as Eisenhower and Dulles and Adenauer had. In 1984, for instance, even the hardline Reagan administration remembered Churchill's earlier efforts approvingly. In a foreign policy speech shortly before negotiations with Gorbachev were to be considered, which led, as you know, to the end of the Cold War a few years later, Secretary of State George Shultz approvingly quoted Churchill's belief that despite the existence of severe political conflicts and disagreements among the world's major powers, informal talks and formal negotiations could do no harm. Quoting from Churchill's controversial 1953 speech, Schultz said that it would be unwise to wait too long before being prepared to enter into talks. He quoted Churchill directly by saying, "It would be a mistake to assume that nothing can be settled unless or until everything is settled." Jaw was clearly better than war, as Churchill had also once said. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Klaus, for this fascinating reassessment of Churchill in the 1950s. I wonder whether we might begin the discussion by asking you to say a little bit more about the way in which the other parties responded to Churchill at the time, the Russians and the French and the Germans themselves. You mentioned Adenauer at the end, the kind of other views of Churchill. Yeah.
The French would have come on board if the Americans and the West Germans had pushed for the idea or agreed with Churchill. The French never were the problem. The problem from Churchill's point of view in particular with the French was that they were rather disorganized at that particular point in time. Governments, changed very quickly, and the governments were never all that stable. But regarding his summit diplomacy, the French would have come on board, he believed, and I think there is something in that. But Churchill, of course, didn't respect the French all that much. He basically wanted to have a summit between three powers, the Soviets, the Americans, and the British, as it had been at Yalta and Potsdam. And only Eisenhower's insistence made sure that the French always would be included, but that wasn't Churchill's idea. Adenauer was deeply upset by Churchill's plans because he really feared to have his Western policy undermined, and Eisenhower and Dulles fully agreed with them. So the combined opposition of the United States and West Germany and Churchill's own Foreign Office, which were really clearly in bed with the Americans and the West Germans, that really was too much for Churchill to overcome. And Adenauer basically first wanted to have the Western integration of West Germany fully finalized by, in the end, West German membership of NATO before any questions regarding the wider German question could be approached. He always feared a deal of the superpowers between the West German back, and he also feared the neutralization of Germany. He always was in favor of West Germany's Western integration. The mic has gone bad.
Susan, okay, I don't want to swap this out. Okay. Here, but here you can use this one for Susan.
Yeah, thank you. This is certainly an interesting question, but Churchill didn't really deal with these issues at all. He was, in a way, quite debilitated and had to focus, and he did focus on very few issues. He was particularly interested in Egypt because that had historical reasons for him. So he dealt quite in detail with the 1954 treaty, which he resented, and he wanted to prevent it. So he followed the negotiations with Egypt very closely. He followed East-West relations closely and related questions like Germany and Eastern Europe. And that was about it. He did not deal with the Korean War, for example. Of course, the Korean War, by the time Eisenhower came to office and Stalin's death occurred, the Korean War was settled, or shortly afterwards it was settled. And in 51, 52, he did not use the Korean War as a lever for achieving an East-West détente. Also, for example, you would, even more appropriate, you would imagine that in 1952, when Stalin came forward with the Stalin Note of March 1952, suggesting a neutral and reunified Germany, that he would have jumped at the opportunity to look into that, because in a way it was actually the same or similar idea he had in 1953. But he didn't. He left the Battle of the Notes, as it was called, entirely almost to the Foreign Office. He knew, of course, what was happening, but he didn't come up with any interesting memorandum or suggestions, or he made no particularly worthwhile speeches about it. Somehow he didn't think that under Stalin, because of the purges in which occurred at the same time and the show trials in the East, that it was worth his while. And also Truman had shot him down and had made clear that he wasn't really interested in getting anything going. So he, in a way, as you say, he missed that opportunity totally. What he really wanted to achieve was to maintain Britain's role as a world power. That, I think, was behind all of his détente policies. Of course, he also wanted to make the world safe. He wanted to prevent a nuclear holocaust and all that. But he also clearly wanted to make sure that Britain would remain one of the big three. That was behind it all. And it is sad, but he didn't really have the energy and imagination to use any of the other manifold topics which arose at that time to look into it or to exploit it. He simply didn't. Thank you. He was born in 1874. So he was early 70s, yeah. He was 70 when he got back into office in 51.
Professor Emil Leffler.
Klaus, I was wondering if you could comment on the debate going on amongst scholars of Soviet foreign policy about the possibility of détente, so to speak, after Stalin's death. As you know, Wojtek Masny says that it was inconceivable that you could have had such a détente. Jeffrey Roberts, in his recent writings, looking very extensively at the new foreign ministry records and at Molotov's own papers, claims that it was entirely possible to begin a serious negotiation. I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Yes, I'm quite optimistic that something might have been possible but it was a short window of opportunity, I believe, between early March 1953 and mid-June 1953. Before the uprising in East Germany. Once the uprising in East Germany had happened, the Soviet Union probably realized if they came up with any new radical departures from the past, it would lead to uprisings and instability in the East. And at that stage, unlike, of course, in 1989, 1990, they were certainly not prepared to entertain that thought. Before the uprising had happened, there was something like the Barrier Plan, and I think the Barrier Plan has been much disputed whether it ever existed or whether it was really a serious, genuine piece of paper. But the Barrier Plan, I do believe, was generally meant, was the Barrier's suggestion to accept a neutral reunification of Germany, not least for economic reasons, because they were subsidizing East Germany to a large extent, and that was overstretching the Soviet Union. He wanted to spare resources for internal build-up of Soviet strength. And I think there was a debate within the Politburo. Molotov was strongly opposed it, and Malenkov was more on the side of Beria. And that was all scuppered by the uprising in East Germany and also by Beria's own arrest for different reasons, though that was quoted in the end that he had become a traitor, had been a British spy. But I think that the real reason has something to do with a power battle rather with reasons of substance, of policy. But that all made these ideas impossible to entertain further. So I think there was, to summarize, there was a short window of opportunity of 2-3 months between March and June 1953. After the uprising, I think it was impossible because Moscow realized it would have led to the unraveling of the empire, or at least to the danger of the unraveling, which would have lead to similar uprisings elsewhere. That's a short answer.
Well, Adenauer doesn't want this plan. The Soviets, I think you're quite correct, after June of '53, don't want this plan. They're committed to their shaky satellite. The Foreign Office doesn't want this plan. The United States doesn't want this plan. East Germany certainly doesn't want this plan. The French, by this time, probably, you can't guarantee that a neutralized Germany is going to be a demilitarized Germany forever. I mean, look what happened in 1935. So it seems to me totally overdetermined that this plan has any prospect of success. Or am I wrong? And if so, is just a bit of quixotry on Churchill's part?
You're right. With hindsight, you're perfectly right. But of course, Churchill didn't assume that would be so. First of all, he thought that he would convince Eisenhower. He really believed he could push him about to some extent. He viewed him as still the junior of the Second World War, and he was very relieved when Eisenhower became president and when Truman decided not to run again. And he immediately rushed to Washington, even before Eisenhower's inauguration. Actually, Eisenhower wasn't all that pleased because he had enough visitors, and there was that famous British as well. So Churchill always believed he could persuade Eisenhower, and his 54 attempt was actually made because he still believed in that, even after the experience of the Bermuda Conference of December '53. He wasn't, of course it was partially or to a large extent wishful thinking, but he constructed it in his own mind as possible to convince Eisenhower. With Adenauer, he knew, of course, that Adenauer was very skeptical, but not unjustifiably. He realized if West German public opinion would have become strongly in favor, Adenauer would have had no chance, unless he wanted to lose power, than to go along with it. And he also realized if the Americans were on board, Adenauer would have come on board as well, whether he liked it or not. That was clear. So I think he banked everything on Eisenhower and on the United States. And he was a proponent of the special relationship. He had an American mother. He felt he was but from his own point of view, he believed he had particularly talents to bring the Americans on board. And he also believed, of course, also quite unrealistically, if such a big three summit occurred, that his talents of persuasion and negotiation would actually be able to make a difference. In my view, of course, even if such a big three conference had taken place, I don't think that would have led to a radical termination of the Cold War. But that, of course, was not how he saw it himself. He strongly believed in it himself. But as I tried to make clear, apart from these really genuine idealistic beliefs, there also were very pragmatic ideas in his mind. Britain's great power role, make maybe demilitarization possible for Britain, make it cheaper, economically better, and personal factors were very large. He wanted to be again on the world stage as a visionary leader. He wanted to be not just a war maker, but he wanted to be a peacemaker, and that was very intense. And then the closer it got to his retirement and the worse his health became, he wanted to delay his retirement. And as we know from history, that is not totally unusual. That is, many people have tried to do that, particularly in British history. No one really wanted to retire. Just think of Mrs. Thatcher. They had to push her out of Downing Street.
One last comment. I think as you do this, I mean, the one dimension I think that, I haven't been in these documents for many, many years, but the amount of energy that went into figuring out how to rearm West Germany, the plans, is just so tremendous. I mean, in bargaining in the West. And to unravel that particular aspect, when it was clearly the aspect that the Russians wished to unravel, too, seems to me, something that may deserve more emphasis in this story.
Yeah, no, I agree. But Churchill, of course, was never convinced of the EDC, the European Defence Community. He only gave in because of pressure from almost everyone else. And the whole British establishment, including the British military, they were really on the side of Churchill here. They gave in and agreed to it, but of course they refused to join the EDC themselves. But they kind of accepted it because of American pressure and of a lack of alternative. Churchill spoke of a sludgy amalgam. He didn't believe that the EDC was actually a working force, that you could militarily achieve anything with it, as he was strongly convinced soldiers fight for their motherland, they don't fight for Europe or some abstract notion of defending the European continent. And so if that had unraveled, never mind the energy which went into it, and there wasn't that much energy spent on the British side for that anyway, he would have been confirmed. He thought it was militarily useless and senseless. And the final NATO solution came, of course, much closer to what also Churchill viewed as militarily effective.
Was there a particular historical analogy that influenced Churchill, like the Congress of Vienna or some other instance that he was maybe had been exposed to in his youth and was harkening back to as seeking?
Not that I know of. I never found him mentioning the Congress of Vienna. What he tends to mention is the Potsdam Conference, that he believed that the Potsdam Conference hadn't really been completed properly. Not least he was out of office by then. It wasn't him, but Attlee who was there at the end. So he always felt that the Potsdam Conference had been left kind of semi-unfinished, and he wanted to complete it and overcome the Second World War with proper peace treaties and everything. That was what he referred back. And the other thing he referred back to was the Locarno Treaty of 1925. But hardly anyone, of course, understood that. People weren't quite aware what it actually meant. It was a long time back. And so that wasn't actually all that persuasive. So that was what Churchill looked for in the past. But what people did understand was the Potsdam analogy, that he wanted to have a reopening and conclusion of the Potsdam Conference. And also, maybe if I can add that to Charles Meyer's point, that the Foreign Office was so strongly opposed to his opinion, that of course to him was unexpected, and he never believed that would be a decisive force. He didn't regard officials very highly. For them they were just, servants essentially, not someone who could actually play a role. But as we now know, I think the Foreign Office was highly decisive. If they hadn't leaked his secret plans or his secret thoughts, the West would have been much less alarmed. In a way, the Foreign Office officials were clearly on the side of Eisenhower and Adenauer and very much opposed to the policy of their own prime minister. So the loyalty of the Foreign Office officials were certainly did not lie with Churchill. They lay with him as a person. They always liked him, and they also thought he was difficult to work for. But he had, of course, charisma. And they in a way, they got on with him. But as far as substance was concerned on these issues, they certainly didn't see eye to eye. And neither did Eden. Eden only gave weakly in because Churchill always promised, I'm retiring after that initiative has been successful. And then Eden said, oh well, if that is what it takes to make you retire, let's go ahead. And he was really quite weak in the whole episode. He didn't like it what Churchill proposed at all.
your presentation was very interesting and very polished, and I think what's sort of hidden in it is all the work you've done, all the archival work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different archives that you've worked in and how you were able to fit together the various responses to things that you seem to have found.
Yeah, mostly British and American archives, American National Archives, the various presidential libraries, Eisenhower and Eisenhower Abilene, as we all know, is a pleasure to work in. and Princeton, where the Dulles papers are, and then also some German archives. A lot of various archival sources flew into that. And also I looked a lot at the British parliamentary papers and British private papers in Churchill, in Oxford, in London, the House of Lords, various things like that. But the main archives were really the National Archives and the British Public Record Office, as it used to be called, now also the National Archives, and then the various smaller archives I mentioned.
No Soviet?
No, not. And at the time when I did most of my research on that, nothing was available actually. What has become available is the information about the Beria thing. That has become available, and I've looked at that, not in Moscow, but I've looked at that, and. People differ about the value of the Beria plant, and much greater Soviet experts than I have very conflicting opinions. Personally, I tend to believe that Beria was serious about it for very selfish reasons in order to strengthen the Soviet Union. But in the last resort, I don't think we can prove that yet.
Steve Lipson, you had mentioned in 1953 Churchill was advocating, one of his major plans was the German reunification and demilitarization. But in 54 and 55, it seemed he was more wanting a summit for the purpose of a summit. Yeah. But even if a summit had happened in 54 and 55, was he thinking the British would propose anything, or did he have an outcome that he specifically wanted to get from the summit? What role do you think? What was his vision of what would happen in the summit?
To be honest, to be quite frank, I don't think that he had thought that far. He thought a summit is good for its own sake. And once a summit is there, I will be able to make my voice heard. He believed which was true, he was the only surviving man of the big three of World War II. So he had a special responsibility, he believed, and also, not being shy, believed he had special talents and special intellect and special powers of persuasion, and he could make a difference. But he hadn't yet planned what he would actually do at the summit. He really always talked about informal discussions, personal conversations, not precisely worked out agenda, but get together, have a drink, and talk about things. That was how he saw it. But he probably would have tried to think about it a little bit more if a summit had been scheduled for in a few months' time. But it was so difficult to get there, and he was so occupied with actually trying to convince Eisenhower in particular to give his agreement that he didn't really have time or energy to think much beyond that. And that, of course, also weakened his position with Eisenhower, because they weren't impressed by that general get-together, and it sounded like a class reunion, and that is not what they really wanted to hear. And also Churchill, of course, overrated himself. He was ailing. He had his third stroke in 1953, and the third one was a severe stroke. For some time it looked as if he had to retire on health grounds. And unfortunately for Eden himself at that time had a gallbladder operation, first in England, which went disastrously wrong, then in Boston, which was done okay, but he still was feeling very ill, so he was actually recuperating himself. If Eden had been totally fit and had been there to take over, it is likely that Churchill would not have survived that stroke in a political sense. But as it was, the heir apparent was out of action, the Prime Minister was out of action, and the Conservative Party didn't like the number 3, Rep Butler. They didn't want to see him as Prime Minister. And even when Eden had to resign because of Suez, and there was a discussion the debate between Macmillan and Butler, who should take over the conservative old boys network, they all came out strongly in favor of Macmillan. They simply didn't like Butler. He was tainted with a brush of appeasement in the Second World War. He had been one of Chamberlain's confidants, and he was seen as a wet. No one really liked him. And at that stage, no one else was consulted. It was really 10 grandees of the Conservative Party who got together in a country house over the weekend with a glass of scotch or two and said, so who is going to be our leader? Who is going to be prime minister? That was the way it was done at that time. And Butler didn't have a chance. So in a way, Eden was highly unfortunate that he was out of action when Churchill had his stroke in June 1953. And there also was a deadline set to Churchill, said, if you cannot give the conference speech, the annual conference speech the leader of the party always gives in October of that year, that's about it. Then you will have to retire because we need someone who can perform. Over the summer, the foreign or two, John Colvin and another Foreign Office official, they really were prime ministers. They signed letters in Churchill's name coming out of Downing Street. That was not signed by Churchill, he was sick, but by them. And they took over the government. But in October, he had to perform. And Churchill did perform. He gave a good speech in early October. He was propped up with, a truckload of pills and things like that. But he did perform. And then he was back. And, of course, in his own mind, he was much stronger than he really was. He was ailing, and he had very little energy, and the little energy he had, he stubbornly focused on summit diplomacy and very few other matters. So in a way, it also was a sad affair, to be honest.
Yep.
Could you say a little bit more about British public opinion? I mean, you've been talking about how this plays with a very small circle, but how was he perceived, and how were these initiatives perceived by people?
Actually, that's a good question, actually very positively, and that made it so difficult for Eisenhower and Adenauer. The British public were less optimistic or less impressed than, let's say, the German public or the rest of Europe, but also the British. Of course, who wants a nuclear war? And the Cold War was often painted in very dark colors, that, nuclear war was just around the corner. And here was that very esteemed prime minister who was highly popular still, and he suggested how to overcome it. That went down extremely well. And the Foreign Office had to be very careful how to play it. So that's a very good point, and I should have perhaps said something about that in my talk. That really was maybe the only other support Churchill had. British public opinion, and particularly also Western public opinion, even in the United States, but particularly in Germany. And Adenauer could not simply say, go away, I don't want such a summit. That public opinion in West Germany would never have forgiven him. And he faced an election. In 1953, he faced an election. And the United States, they once said, Adenauer is the best German we have since Bismarck. And they believed it. They really wanted Adenauer to stay in power. And Adenauer himself, being a clever guy, he always told the Americans, you never know who comes after me. It looks dire. I'm pro-Western. All the rest is highly anti-Western, which of course was totally untrue. But the United States, and particularly Dulles, believed it. And he was very close to Dulles. And once Dulles actually died and passed away, Adenauer's influence in the White House also declined. So that personal relationship between the two, I think, propped up Adenauer. That also meant he had to take into account German public opinion. And so that had to be finessed. They couldn't just tell we don't want a summit. So instead of having a prime minister summit, essentially, they went for a foreign minister summit, which was, of course, less likely to make major decisions. And the personnel at at such a foreign minister summit was seen as more reliable, less idiosyncratic than Churchill. But public opinion was strongly in favor of what Churchill came out with, definitely.
Right. To an amateur in this area, the most surprising thing I heard you say was the debunking of the 1946 Fulton, Missouri Iron Curtain speech. But I was having a little trouble putting together the two things you said about it. One was that Churchill was actually quite late in perceiving what was happening, was trying to rectify his reputation, but that it did have a decisive impact in Moscow. So is it that somehow Churchill's stature in Moscow was higher than elsewhere, and they were not aware?
I didn't debunk the speech. I tried to read it in a more, let's say, hopefully more sophisticated way, because normally the Iron Curtain speech is simply seen as that anti-Soviet aggressive speech by Churchill. And that was certainly the way the Soviet Union saw it. Definitely. But I think when you read the Iron Curtain speech more carefully, or beyond that one paragraph, then I think it becomes clear that Churchill wasn't just calling for aggression against the Soviet Union. At the same time, he also called for negotiations, for coming to a settlement. He was, he was more sophisticated than just an aggressive Cold Warrior.
They reacted to that.
Yes. No, they didn't. They saw that one paragraph, yes. But in the Iron Curtain speech, and that is also mostly overlooked, he also talks already about a united Europe. That also is part of the Iron Curtain speech, which is also never mentioned. What people focus on is that one paragraph from the Adriatic and so on. We all know it. I wanted to actually play the clip, but then it didn't work, so I gave it up. So I wasn't debunking the Iron Curtain speech. No, what I'm saying is Churchill, of course, he had seen the Soviet threat to some extent, definitely. But he also swayed to and fro. And you can find statements of him totally anti-Stalin and anti-communism in 45, 44. But you also find statements for him which say, well, I'm hopeful. Stalin is a good man. We can work with him. So he was not as clearly prescient regarding the future as he had been with Hitler. He never said, "Oh, we can cooperate with Hitler. Oh, he's a good man, maybe." So with Stalin, because he had met him, he had actually been drawn into his personal charm, charisma, as had Roosevelt. They both competed for his favor. So I think with Stalin and anti-communism, it was in 45. It was more to and froing. And 46, of course, he had come down clearly on the basis that communism is a threat, and we need to do something about it, not just by war, but also by negotiation. And he wanted to make that clear in Fulton. Actually, to say something about the impact of the Iron Curtain speech, initially the Iron Curtain speech did not go down well at all. In the United States, public opinion thought Churchill went over the top. That was a much too aggressive, unfair speech. In the United States, in particular at that stage, the Uncle Joe image of Stalin was still very prevalent. Only a few months later, I think in the summer of 46, gradually people came round to what was perceived as Churchill anti-Soviet rhetoric. And then also the Truman administration became more clearly anti-communist. Initially, for example, Truman distanced himself from a Churchill speech. When public opinion was negative, Truman said, "I didn't know what the man was about to say. I was just sitting there." Of course he had read the speech on the train up to Missouri. They both shared a railway carriage, and Truman had read the entire speech. So had the government in London. They had given him actually secret information so that he knew about what he was talking. As soon as public opinion was critical in London, they said, "Oh, we didn't know. Leader of the opposition, we don't control him." And Truman the same. And once public opinion got in favor of Churchill's speech by mid-1946, roughly, then, of course, Truman associated himself again with the speech. So, politics is not always a truthful business.
Yes, I don't know.
You've talked about public opinion in Adenauer's case and support in public opinion. But what about Eisenhower's having to deal with public opinion, which was quite different and could be a factor in his not being willing to move to a summit?
Yeah. what I found was that public opinion in the United States was not as pro-Churchill and as pro trying to check out the new leaders as it was in Europe and in Britain. I think that skepticism which came out from the government and was shared by the press had an impact on public opinion. So there wasn't, I can't tell you now the percentage points, but there wasn't a strong movement or a strong pressure on the president to do something about checking out the situation. Eisenhower was relatively immune on that issue from public opinion. So I never found any references that they feared that would have negative repercussions on their standing with public opinion. That really was an issue for the Europeans. And of course, the Europeans, they were divided. It was them who had to face the rearmament question. The United States was still far away and couldn't really be reached by Soviet missiles. The Soviets had only just exploded a nuclear bomb and intercontinental missiles that was still a few years off. So I think the United States still felt quite aloof from what was happening, to some extent at least. As well, yes, that's, yeah, McCarthyism played into the opposite, yes, that's right, yeah.
I think it's probably time to call for a last question. Yes.
One comment, two questions. First of all, thank you very much for a very incisive and scholarly presentation. Number two, I've sat here and wondered what Winston Churchill might think about what you've just shared with us. Number three is you've spoken of one of the iconic figures of the 20th century, a man who was a gifted communicator, an inspirational man, great motivator. Been regarded as a guru by those who are involved with communications and leadership development, had the gifted powers of delegation and team building. Could you talk a little maybe about that and what you saw in your research?
Yeah. Thanks very much. What Churchill would have thought, that's very interesting. Personally, to be honest, I think well, I'm of course not uncritical, but think on the whole I'm pretty sympathetic and don't just debunk him, and say, well, these all were weird ideas, forget about it. So I try really to put myself into his shoes and see what the possibilities might have been. So personally, I think I'm not without sympathy. When the book came out, I thought that would be the general perception. Real Churchill fans, they thought I was disrespectful and much too critical and really didn't do judgment to the guy. And I was utterly taken aback because that is not how I saw or still see myself. But for a real aficionado of Churchill, I'm much too critical, much too anti-Churchill. I, dare to question his grand strategies and grand visions. And I think that's a lot of rubbish, I really think that one has to critically assess his performance. And while there was some imaginative thinking behind it, the realities of the time were really running against him. That wasn't just his fault, but of course it was his fault that he didn't always see what the realities were at the time. Eisenhower, the West Germans, the integration, and so on, and the Western integration, and so on. As far as Churchill's standing was concerned, British public opinion never wavered in the opinion that he was a great man. And he had the charisma, he had the rhetoric, of course, all these nice anecdotes. And these were years when the flashlight of the cameras and the pencils and the video recorders were not as closely focused on the centers of powers as they are today. Churchill got away with his stroke. Hardly anyone knew. I can't remember when it was. In the mid-70s, when John Colville's memoirs were or diaries were published, we suddenly found out that Churchill's stroke was much more severe, that he was really incapacitated for 2 months, and that the officials ran the government and the Prime Minister's office. We really didn't know that before. Some, and the press, some journalists did know, but they kept quiet, never let on. There were some rumors flying about, but no one took them seriously. So in a way, Churchill benefited a lot from that. First of all, because of that was how it was done at the time. Secondly, of course, they took, because of his wartime role, his hero standing in the meantime, they took particular kind to him and were very kind. Also in the United States, he was always feted. And though I quoted a kind of vulgar remark by Eisenhower at Bermuda, that was an exception. Normally, Eisenhower treated him very respectful, very nice. And in my mind, that also misled Churchill. If people treat you too respectful and are too impressed by your thoughts, apparently, then of course you must come to the conclusion, well, these thoughts are great. And maybe I will convince him to come along and agree with me. And I think that partially misled Churchill what the Americans were thinking, because they were highly respectful. And only Dulles was an exception, but he disliked Dulles anyway and didn't take him seriously. So, that Eisenhower was different, that really convinced him, together with a good portion of wishful thinking, that he was right. So I don't think that Churchill had to complain about a lack of respect and a lack of attention on the whole. I don't think so.
Let's conclude by letting me say that I agree with the thrust of this comment. I don't think that it denigrates Churchill's historic stature to examine very carefully the individual cases. Klaus, we want to thank you, and we hope everyone will join us for a glass of